Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Terumot. We're up to Perek Bet Mishnah Vav. Today's Mishnot should be L'Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Aranbai ben Eliyahu ben Bacha Israelov Menuchatam Began Eden Amen. The Mishnah is going to cite more applications of the rule that a person can designate superior produce as terumah for inferior produce, but not the other way around. The Mishnah says, V'tormin zete shemen al zete kevesh. One may separate oil olives, which are olives that have a high oil content and are used to produce oil, as terumah for pickling olives, which are olives that contain little oil, which are pickled to preserve them for later consumption. And the reason you can separate oil olives as terumah for pickling olives is because oil olives taste better than pickling olives. V'lo zete kevesh al zete shemen, but you may not separate pickling olives as terumah for oil olives. V'yain sheno mevushal al mevushal. One may designate uncooked wine as terumah for cooked wine because uncooked wine tastes better than cooked wine. V'lo min al mevushal al sheno mevushal. But one may not designate cooked wine as terumah for uncooked wine. Now we learned that terumah cannot be separated from one type of produce for another type of produce. That was in Mishnah Daled. This Mishnah now is going to cite for us a rule for determining when two items are considered one type and when they are not. The rule is based on the Torah's prohibition against kilayim, which is forbidden mixtures, which states that two different types of plants cannot be planted together. Zeh this is the rule. Kol shu kilayim bechavero. Any two items of produce that are kilayim with each other, meaning the two items cannot be planted together because of the prohibition of kilayim. Lo yitrom mizeh al zeh. One may not separate terumah from one for the other. Since they're classified as different types of produce with regards to kilayim, they are different types with regards to terumah as well. Now, for example, Mefarshim bring down, under the laws of kilayim, it is prohibited to plant wheat and barley together. Therefore, one may not designate wheat as terumah for barley or vice versa. This is prohibited even if a person takes terumah from the better type of produce for the worst type. Any two species of produce that are not kilayim with each other, meaning they can be planted together because they are the same type. One may separate terumah from the better one for the worst one, but not from the worst one for the better one. Now, even when both items are of the same type, the Mishnah is telling us one may not designate terumah from the inferior type as terumah from the superior one. You cannot designate the inferior one as terumah for the superior one. However, if a person separated terumah from the worst one for the better one, his terumah is valid. Except in the case of darna, which is an inferior type of wheat used as birdseed, that was separated as terumah for wheat. She'enan ochel. Why is it? It's invalid. It's an invalid terumah. Why? Because darnel is not human food, and only human food can be designated as terumah. The Mishnah cites a machloket to conclude, va'kishut va'melafefon min echad. The regular cucumber and the Kirby cucumber are one type of produce with regards to terumah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Shnei Minin. Rabbi Yehuda says they are two different types. The Tana Kama and Rabbi Yehuda also disagree in Kilayim, chapter 1, Mishnah 2, as to whether regular cucumbers and Kirby cucumbers can be planted together, and that's why they have the same disagreement here. The Rav tells us, Ve'en halakha Rabbi Yehuda, the halakha does not follow Rabbi Yehuda, rather, regular cucumbers and Kirby cucumbers are one type of produce with regards to terumah and with regards to kilayim. That is the Rabotai of Perek Bet Mishnah Vav. We begin Perek Gimel Mishnah Aleph. The Mishnah discusses situations in which produce designated as terumah is later discovered to be ruined. The Mishnah says, Hatorem kishut v'nimtzet mara, avatiach v'nimtza saruach, terumah v'yachzor v'yitrom. If someone separated a cucumber as terumah for other cucumbers and it is later found to have been bitter, or if one separated a melon as terumah for other melons and it later was found to be spoiled, it is a valid terumah, the Mishnah says, but he must separate terumah again. Now, the Mefarshim point out, in general, if somebody designated inferior produce as terumah for superior produce, although he shouldn't have done that, we just learned in the previous Mishnah that terumah is valid b'diavad. However, bitter cucumbers and spoiled melons are worse than any other inferior produce. Why? Because they're not eaten. Therefore, designating bitter cucumbers for other cucumbers or spoiled melons for other melons is an ineffective terumah, an ineffective designation. It is like designating tameh produce as terumah for tahor produce, which is rabbinically ineffective, since terumah that's tameh cannot be eaten. In fact, the Mefarshim point out, if you look at the Mefarshim brought down by the Art School Elucidated, the rabbis were stricter in our Mishnah's case than where a person designated tameh produce as terumah for tahor produce. Why? Because over there they ruled that if the designation was made by mistake, the person didn't know that the produce was tameh, the terumah is valid, and he doesn't have to separate terumah again. But here they ruled that even if the designation was made by mistake, he didn't know the cucumbers were bitter or that the watermelon was spoiled, he must separate terumah again. The reason for this difference is that over there, the person had no way of knowing that the produce was tameh, so he is blameless, and the rabbis require nothing of him. You did it, but it's fine. Here, the person should have first tasted the produce in order to determine whether it was fully edible. Since he failed to do so, the rabbis made him separate a second terumah. Now, the Tosfot Yom Tov points out, seemingly, he could have not tasted the produce before he designated it as terumah, since at that time it was still tevel. So one solution that Tosfot Yom Tov offers is that he could have cut off a small part of the cucumber or watermelon and separate terumot and masot from that part. Then he would have been allowed to eat the rest of that part. Okay. Mishnah brings in now a similar case. Hatorem chavit shel yain v'nimtzet shel chometz. If someone separates a barrel of wine as terumah for other wine and later it's found to be vinegar, for example, a person had 50 barrels of wine and he wanted to separate 1/50 as terumah, so he designated one barrel as terumah for all the others. He discovered afterwards that the wine in that designated barrel had turned into vinegar. The Mishnah says, Im yadua shaita shel chometz ad shelo teramah and not terumah. The halakha is like this. If it is now known that the liquid in the barrel was already vinegar before he separated as terumah, it is not a valid terumah. Why? Because wine and vinegar are regarded as different types of produce, so terumah cannot be separated from one for the other. But if it is now known that it's soured only after he separated as terumah, it is a valid terumah because it was still wine at the time that he separated it. Im safek, if there is a doubt as to when it became vinegar, terumah, it is a valid terumah because it might have been wine when it was separated, but he must separate terumah again because on the other hand, it might have been vinegar at that time and it would have been invalid. And the Mefarshim point out that in cases like this, where the facts are unknown, we applied the rule of safek doraita lechumra. Anytime you have a doubt regarding a biblical law, we treat it strictly. Therefore, since the designation was possibly valid, the separated portion is subject to the stringency of terumah. For example, it cannot be eaten by non-kohanim. But on the other hand, since the designation was possibly not valid, the entire crop must be treated with the stringencies of tevel, meaning it cannot be eaten by anyone until a second portion of terumah is designated. Now, the second portion is somewhat smaller than the first because it's separated only on behalf of the barrels that remain after the first barrel was separated. Although the first portion might be tevel if it was vinegar and his designation as terumah was ineffective, the owner is not obligated to tithe that portion itself, since it must go to a Kohen. In any case, the Chachamim imposed the tithing obligation on the Kohen. Therefore, for example, if the owner originally had 50 barrels of wine and he designated one of them as terumah, he then designates a 50th of the remaining 49 barrels, which is 49/50th of a single barrel. And now only one of the two portions is actually terumah. If the first portion was wine, when it was separated, the designation was effective, and therefore that's the real terumah. But if it was vinegar at that time, the designation was not effective, and the second portion is the real terumah. Therefore, although the owner cannot eat, he's forbidden to eat both portions because either one might be terumah, he only has to give one to a Kohen for free because the Kohen does not have a monetary right to both of them. On top of that, he may give the Kohen the smaller portion because matters of monetary ownership are decided according to the rule Amutzi mechavero alav haraya. The burden of proof rests on the person who's trying to take from the other. In our case, the burden of proof rests on the Kohen who's claiming the terumah as from the owner. Since the Kohen cannot prove that the first larger portion is the actual terumah, he must settle for the second smaller one. Now, in theory, After giving the smaller portion to the Kohen, the owner could keep the larger one for himself, but since he cannot use it in any case, for its terumah, he sells it to a Kohen. The Mishnah discusses now some of the consequences of having these two portions, only one of which is real terumah. The Mishnah says, Harishona ena midama'at bifnei atzma. If the first portion falls into ordinary produce by itself, it does not make the mixture midumah. Midumah is a forbidden mixture of terumah and ordinary produce. The Mefarshim point out that according to the Torah law, it is if a forbidden food like terumah gets mixed with a larger amount of permitted food of the same type, min b'mino it's called, the forbidden food is nullified and the entire mixture is permitted. This is following the rule of bitul berov, nullification in a majority. However, mixtures of terumah and chulin, chulin is ordinary non-terumah produce, the Chachamim rabbinically forbade it unless the amount of chulin in the mixture is at least 100 times more than the amount of terumah. This rabbinically forbidden mixture of terumah and chulin is called midumah. So in the Mishnah's case, where it's possible that the terumah portion is not terumah, the rabbinic law of midumah does not apply because of the rule safek derabbanan nekula. Anytime you have a doubt regarding a rabbinic law, we treat it leniently. Therefore, instead of applying the more stringent rabbinic law, which is midumah, we follow the biblical law that the mixture is permitted as long as there is a simple majority of chulin. Now, the Mishnah said, let's continue with the Mishnah. Ve'en chayavin alaya chomesh. And a non-Kohen who ate the first portion by mistake, meaning he didn't realize that it's terumah, he's not obligated to pay the extra fifth for it. Now, ordinarily, the Mefarshim say, a non-Kohen who commits the sin of eating terumah by mistake must pay the Kohen with produce that is worth the principal, meaning the value of the terumah, plus a fifth, which is a quarter of the principal, which is a fifth of the final total. This produce itself becomes terumah. The Mishnah is teaching us that if a non-Kohen eats something that might be terumah, he is required to pay only the principal and not the fifth. Now, the reason for this halacha is that the non-Kohen is not forgiven for his sin of eating terumah by mistake unless he separates the principal and designates it as terumah. The penalty of a fifth, however, is not required for forgiveness. It's just a monetary fine that the Torah imposed for eating terumah. Monetary fines are not imposed in cases of a doubt. In fact, to gain forgiveness, it's enough to separate the principal. Although he must give it to the Kohen whose terumah he ate, that's not for the purpose of forgiveness, but only to compensate the Kohen for his monetary loss. But here he doesn't have to give the extra fifth. V'chen hashniya. And the Mishnah concludes the same is true of the second barrel. It doesn't make other produce midumah, and eating it does not carry the penalty of the fifth. That is an abotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen v'amen.